I'm your host Helen Douthwaite Teasdale, and welcome to Brass Evolution, a show where we explore the rich culture and history of the brass banding world. This episode, I chat to returning guest Gavin Holman about his research into the first recorded brass band contests and the most well-documented event, Burton Constable. Well, we're in the thick of the brass band contesting season here in the UK, and I thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to welcome back Gavin Holman to talk about one of our earliest recorded brass band contests and potentially contests even further back than the one we have recorded at Burton Constable. So welcome to the podcast, Gavin.
Thank you, Helen. It's nice to be back with you.
Gavin was our first guest on the first episode of the podcast. So Gavin, for those who don't know you, could you just give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Well, I'm basically an IT specialist by training and my career. I'm now retired, and I've been running the IBEW website for about 30 years now. And apart from keeping a whole load of information about brass bands, my interest in the history of bands has grown over that time, and I've been collecting material and information about bands, bandsmen, and their histories since that time, and producing a number of articles and saying books is probably a bit too expansive a term, but large directories about bands and where they've come and where they're going. And to that extent, I've made a load of contacts across the world with other historians, and it's been quite a rich journey for me. And every day, it seems, I get another snippet of information about something which sometimes leads me down another rabbit hole, which means that some of the things I've got on my list to do get pushed further and further back. But most of the time, I do enjoy actually finding out these small bits of information about bands of the past. And my main ethos in trying to capture all this information is to make sure it isn't lost and somehow record it, in some cases digitize it, so that it is available, A, to the wider community, freely to the world, if you like, and also so it is in a position so that it can be preserved for the future. To that end, I'm very glad to seen the work that's been done in the Brass Band Archive in the last couple of years. And, that is a good step forward in making sure that the history of bands, at least in the UK, is in a good place.
I visited the Brass Band Archive as part of the Brass Bands England conference, and that was sort of based in Salford Keys. We actually did a podcast episode about the archive, so that's a great link, Gavin. So I'll put the link firstly to that podcast episode, and of course to IBEW, which is the most fantastic resource for researching. So today we're going to talk about early brass band contests. Gavin, tell us, where did you start with compiling information about brass band contests? Because it's central to what brass bands do, but how did you come about finding about the earliest contests?
The earliest recorded, well-documented contest is that of at Burton Constable, which you already mentioned. We'll come back to that in a minute. Generally speaking, the documentation for contests is fairly sparse. They're fairly well written up in the band press, particularly the British bandsmen in the early days, less so in recent times, and occasionally in the traditional newspapers. So they're their sort of primary sources of extant information. Some 10 years ago, I can't remember exactly how the Brass Band Results website was set up, which is basically a sort of a crowdsourcing activity whereby anybody can contribute information about band contests. And over the years, myself and many, many others have contributed to that, putting in details of contests that they've got either programs for or the information they found out on the web or wherever. Now, that's a huge resource for contests across the world and across the last couple of 100 years. Personally, I have, as I've been doing my own personal research, I've come across information in newspapers and online, etc., and have used that in various ways. And quite a few years ago, 10, 15, 20, perhaps 20 years ago, I came across Enderby Jackson's record of the Burton Constable contest. He was the chap who went on to establish the first sort of national contests in around about 1860. And he had been spurred into this by attending the Burton Constable contest in 1845, which had been set up by the actual owners of the hall at Burton Constable, which is now in East Yorkshire. There was Sir Clifford and Lady Constable who owned the hall, but they were setting up a large party, partly under the auspices of their friends, the ladies Chichester, who had found some information about, and perhaps even attended, a band contest of some sort in France. And they thought it'd be a good idea to have something similar here. So they got Mr. Lang to actually arrange the competition so that a few local bands were invited to come along and play for a nominal prize for the first and second places. And as I said before, this was in 1845, just a few years after Adolf Sax had invented and patented his first sax horns. Certainly in terms of the instrumentation of the day and the bands that attended this contest, it would have been very variable, and certainly nothing that we could recognise today as being the traditional brass band instrumentation. But they did have some horns, they did have trombones, they had the early cornet equivalents, which are cornetpians, and so forth and so on. So the contest went ahead. There were several bands. There was the Brocklesby Yeomanry Band, which was obviously linked in some respects to a local militia. They had 4 cornetpians, 2 sax tenor horns, 3 trombones, 1 sax bass, and 2 uppercleads, which were the precursors to the modern tuba. And they played a piece by the composer Henry Bishop, Should He Upbraid. That sounded a really interesting piece of music, doesn't it? The second band was Holmes Tannery Band, one of the early industrial bands. They had a similar instrumental makeup, but the leader played one of the new sax cornet à piston, which is basically a piston cornet as we would probably more or less recognise it today. They played a selection from Mozart's 12th Mass. The third band, another industrial band, was the band of the Hull Flax and Cotton Mills. They played Hail Smiling Morn, which to any good Yorkshire person, they'd instantly recognise it, or certainly the West Riding person recognises one of their signature tunes. However, apparently their effort fell fairly flat and they didn't get much applause from the audience. The fourth band was the Wold Brass Band, and bear in mind this is in East Yorkshire, so it's the Yorkshire Wolds are thereabouts. And it was led by James Walker of York, who was one of the local sort of musical impresarios of the day. And he himself led the band with a D-flat soprano cornet, not an E-flat as we're currently used to today. They played a selection of Rossini's Barbara Seville. And the last band to go on was from Batterington, and they played a potpourri of country airs. and the report actually says their instruments were perverse, as well as imperfect, and caused their well-meant efforts to pass totally unregarded by their friends and the populace, and they quietly vacated the stand.
I mean, could it be any more cutting? It did make me laugh when I read that. Serpents.
That's one of the beauties of actually reading some of the newspaper reports, less so in the band press, which tends to be less more staid. Newspaper reports be very cutting about the performances of bands at these contests. So, particularly in the early days. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the second and fourth bands were asked to play again to, choose between them. And the Wold Band was eventually declared the winner with a glorious prize of £12, which in those days was a huge amount of money. And the Holmes Tannery Band got the second prize of £8. So, generally speaking, the contest was a success. And certainly in terms of the attending audience, they enjoyed it thoroughly. So that was Burton Constable, nominally the first full recorded brass band contest. However, if you start to dig a bit closer into all the histories and newspaper reports and everything else, you soon discover that it wasn't the first contest by any stretch of the imagination. We'll never know which were the first contests. In fact, it depends on how you define contest. I mean, contest, you think of, two opponents, or two or more opponents, trying to determine who's the winner in some respect. In the past, certainly, there were a number of get-togethers of bands which can be determined as contests or not, depending on your point of view. But certainly, Enderby Jackson, who I mentioned, wrote this account of the Burton Constable contest, did much later, towards the end of the century, wrote a series of articles in the Musical Opinion and Music Trade Review periodical called The Origin and Promotion of Brass Band Contests. Now, this was a fairly long and rambling discourse that he wrote. And to be honest, there's not much of it about the contest. It's mainly more about the origins of band instruments. It's still a very good read, but it doesn't tell you much more about contests other than his own participation and record of the Burton Constable event. So whilst I would recommend you read it, I don't expect to get anything much more out of it.
When we're talking about Burton Constable, so not a strange setup, but a slightly different setup to what we have now, because majority of contests are set up by bands people in the modern era, but Burton Constable was set up by the aristocracy for working class musicians. So I wonder, Gavin, do we know what spurred on this sort of elite class to create contests for the working man?
Specifically, I don't think they did. I mean, they were just looking for a new form of entertainment. It was something to impress their friends with. You know, it's like going out and saying, "Oh, who's the latest, disco rapper? We'll have him at our party." You know, it's that sort of thing. Nothing to do with trying to do anything for the local, working man or advance music or anything. You know, it's purely the latest, thing. So, unfortunately, we don't need to read any more into it. Certainly, as time went on, the fact that bands became more common throughout the country, their music improved, and they got to a stage where the general population recognized that they did actually provide good entertainment, meant that quite a few events, particularly things like agricultural shows, flower shows, these large public events, included a band contest as part of their range of entertainments. And quite often the band contests were the major draw, in those early days, certainly in the sort of middle to late part of the 19th century. It does mean that those general sponsors of contests were not the aristocracy, and they weren't the bands people. Band officials were brought in to sort of administer it, but they were mainly set up A, as an additional draw to bring people to the event, and B, as a way of raising funds, because it brought a lot more people. And whilst you may have had to shell out a few pounds for the prizes, the actual money you got in terms of the increased audiences was significantly more in most cases. There are a few reports of contests and events where it all fell flat, but hey, we all know things like that, don't we?
The other thing that I found interesting about the Burton Constable, that there was like a specified number of players per band. So I think the maximum number of players for the contest was 12 with no percussion. So do you think that influenced Enderby Jackson's and the perception of contests going forward? Because obviously the numbers of competitors on stage has really increased.
Well, certainly, I mean, in those days, they wouldn't have had any more than about a dozen players anyway, because the bands were fairly small. And as I already said, they had sort of very mixed instrumentation. I mean, it wasn't until much later in the 19th century that we got some form of standardization in contesting, and the rules were set up so that you had to have a certain number of players, and they had to belong to a band, or they had to have a certain sort of type of instrumentation, etc., etc. And of course, percussion was much, much, much later in terms of being allowed. Notwithstanding that, I don't think those rules necessarily influenced Enderby Jackson. A bit may well have done, but they were just ad hoc rules. We don't know why they were set in place, other than the fact they probably didn't want too many of the hoi polloi musicians in their nice Burton Constable gardens.
Too too many bandsmen roaming around the medieval feast that they were preparing.
I think probably bandsmen in those days were equally attracted to liquid refreshment as they are today.
I can almost imagine. Yes, we don't want the wine and beer tent to run out. No. So Burton Constable is our most well recorded in that sense of the first contest. Gavin, could we talk about some of the earlier contests than a Burton Constable and what you found out about them?
Well, I mean, I think it was sparked off because I've been trying to collect information about bands, many years, and I had a couple of snippets of information about particularly the Totnes band, which I found interesting, mainly because they mentioned the fact that that band had a contest or taken part in the contest. Now, this was 2 or 3 years before Burton Constable, which led me to think, maybe that it wasn't certainly the first, or certainly the first documented. So I dug a bit more and found several more instances of bands competing in various forms, certainly here in the UK, and also some instances abroad. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And I came up with about half a dozen or 8 different contests that had happened since 1818 being the earliest. Now, 1818 is actually one of the dates that is, I won't say shrouded in stone, but it's the dates of the earliest bands being formed. Here we're using the word band in a very loose term because, as you know, in those days the instruments didn't really resemble the modern brass band, and you have a number of bands who say, well, we were formed in X or Y, and you think, well, yes, you were, but you weren't a brass band then. You were a wind band, or you're a band of loose musicians, or whatever it was. Regardless of that, I mean, I've got no problem with that. In fact, I quite often have some online arguments with people who say, well, you're writing about bands, history of bands, but you're talking about bands with clarinets in them and ophicleides. And I say, well, yes, but, until the sort of middle of the 19th century or middle to later the 19th century, there was no fixed instrumentation. Bands did have, in fact, you still have the concert band and the wind band today. We're all part of the big, the same sort of musical family. And the only difference being that brass bands have a much more rigid movement and set of rules, et cetera, which has defined them much more than some of the others. So going back into the past, we have a contest with the Stalybridge band at Sheffield. Now, Stalybridge is not that far from Sheffield, but in 1818 it was a fair hike across the Peak District, or the Pennines, depending on your point of view. Now, allegedly, the Stalybridge band itself was formed in 1814, and they had this contest in Sheffield, which they attended. This was spoken of by one of the members of the band, so we don't know exactly how accurate it is in this third-hand hearsay, perhaps. And certainly there are doubts about the ability of the band to go across the Pennines to this contest, but hey, you never know. It also may well be that there was a later contest in Sheffield that the dates may have got mixed up. So this earliest one may be a bit suspect. However, Best of the Barn, my friend Steve Hughes has done a heck of a lot of work researching and documenting the history of, did actually take part in a couple of contests in connection with the coronation celebrations for King George IV and Queen Victoria. The bands who took part in these processions sort of played off against each other, and a winner was chosen. Can't get much less formal than that, really. Than sort of the attending people say, well, which one do you like best? This one, put your hands up. This one, put your hands up, or shout aye, or whatever it is.
Audience prize.
Exactly. Yes. Fairly loose and ill-defined. And then we have, moving forward a bit into 1828, the Bannockburn band and the Deanston band having a face-off, so to speak, at Stirling in January. Both bands apparently seemed to be fairly respectable and played fine airs in excellent style. But the reporter couldn't determine or didn't know which one actually won. So, again, we know that an event took place, but we don't know much more about it. Now, I haven't mentioned military bands yet, but obviously military bands themselves have their own space. They generally didn't take part in a lot of the sort of social engagements that secular and village and town bands did take part in, mainly because they're used primarily for marching and drilling and sort of things to do with either the regiment or the corps that they were attached to. However, they did get out and play from time to time, and two military bands, the 5th Dragoon Guards Band and the 83rd Regiment Band, had a competition at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, in London, in 1834. And that was basically because the two colonels of the two respective band or regiments had a bet as to say which band was the best. They even had the band playing some sight reading music to try and work out which one could, be the better performers.
You can kind of like imagine, like a couple of beers in at the officers' mess. My band's better than your band. Your band's better than my. Setting down the challenge. Really,
and you can imagine the mustachioed colonels actually sort of fighting about it afterwards. In the end, the 5th Dragoon Guards was determined to be the better ensemble, but generally speaking, they were too close to really call it. The 5th Dragoon did edge towards the winning post at the end. Then we move on to Totnes, which I mentioned earlier. Now, Totnes being in Devon, had a competition with its local rival, the Modbury Band. They took part actually in 3 contests over a period of a few years, in 1843 and 1844. This again a year before Burton Constable. And when the town heard the news of the birth of Princess Alice, they went into celebration mode. And a challenge was given by the Modbury Band to say, well, hang on a minute, we're a better band than you. Come and actually, entertain the people. So they arranged this trial of skill between the two bands. And they had a number of umpires, as they are called in those days, to adjudicate bands. Apparently, it was a very civilized event, with each band giving 10 selections of music. So it's quite a long time. Obviously, they were entertaining the crowd at the same time. The Totnes Band went all out with difficult selections by well-known composers. The Modbury Band had slightly simpler choices of music. The overall result in this first sort of round was a draw. They had a decision to try again sometime in the future. Totnes Band apparently arrived at the field, played boldly, marching up to the place, and preceded by their banner, which had been painted by R. Harris Jr., one of the amateurs of the band, but not expressly for this purpose. The Modbury folks had arrived sometime previously with their referee, Mr. Burton, from the Royal Marines Band in Plymouth, but they wanted to reserve their breath until the time of the contest, so they didn't play as they walked up. So they obviously had a good time in this first contest, and it's an indication that when it goes down the years, you quite often find these derbies between local bands playing off one against the other in an unofficial and sort of friendly way, usually for pints of beer afterwards or something similar.
I absolutely love the fact that bands are sort of issuing challenges, you can kind of see it happening, but also the fact that the contests are more of a public spectacle, like outdoors in public spaces, long selections, different variety, and also the fact that we can issue a draw.
Well, that's it. And 90% of the band contests in the 19th century were outside, and they were to large audiences, and they were often part of another activity or event that was going on. They did have cash prizes and instrumental prizes, and sometimes they played, like today, own choice, and sometimes there was a set test beat. But at the end of the day, it was an entertainment for the crowds rather than something specifically for the bands themselves.
We talked a little bit about who was umpiring or adjudicating the contest. Do we know any more about who specifically was adjudicating? We've chatted about, members of the public and sort of who do you think's better, but did the organisers or bands bring their own officials, or was there specific umpires?
Well, we know that in a number of these contests, they did have specific umpires or adjudicators. Quite often, they would bring in someone who knew what they were talking about, in theory. So it would be the
theory, of course.
It would be the local. It'd be the bandmaster. Quite often, it was the bandmaster of a local militia or a volunteer regiment or something like that. But someone who had a musical standing and knew about bands. So, quite often, I say you have when adjudicators are named, certainly in the early days, the fact that they are related to military music in some way is quite often the case. Occasionally, also, you find it's someone who owns a local music shop, or has written composed some music or something. But generally speaking, it is someone who has some standing, both in terms of their status, both professionally and possibly within the community and the society. Occasionally, it might just well be, the local pub landlord who's asked to give an opinion, or again, as we mentioned before, the audience themselves who show their pleasure or displeasure in whatever way is appropriate.
A lot of pressure for the pub landlord to make the right decision there, but yes.
And this brings me on to another category of people who occasionally were adjudicators or umpires, were local vicars, because they were people who were looked up to, and they may not have as much musical knowledge as others, but at least they sang hymns and what have you in churches, so they may have professed to know a bit. The local vicar at Dipford, a few miles from Totnes, had attended this first bash between Modbury and Totnes, and thought, oh, that's a good idea. I might be able to use this to reduce the amount of antisocial behaviour in my parish. If I have this contest, people flock to it, and they'll not go out throwing rocks at each other or whatever else they were doing at the time. So he put up some money for a prize and invited 6 local bands to this contest. This is in 1843. And unfortunately, only 2 turned up, which is, half the course in some places. And they were the brass and the reed bands from Totnes itself. And this took place, and it was a dull day, and it wasn't a particularly good contest. And the brass band from Totnes eventually won and got the prize of £4 again, and not an amount of money which was well worth it in those days. And the contest took place, but it wasn't a particularly auspicious event as far as the vehicle was concerned. And I suspect he lost some money on it. Whether or not it made any difference to his local yobs and rowdies, we don't know.
I just can't get over the fact that the clergy were adjudicating brass band contests. Can you mention that in 2024? Fantastic.
No comment.
I know. Upstanding members of the local society, of course.
Yes. I will just briefly say that the Totnes band went on to compete at another contest that year at Newhouse, arranged by another person who thought they could, get something out of it. And then moving across to Wiltshire in 1844, the Holt and Winsley bands had a competition between themselves, again based on a wager as to who was the best. This really was the last of the pre-Burton Constable contest. There was another one which was intended to take place in 1844 between Earlstoke and Market Lavington bands, but a challenge was issued and the bands got ready, but it just sort of fizzled out and didn't happen. So I mentioned at the beginning that Ladies Chichester, who'd actually sort of put the idea for the Burton Constable contest in the first instance, had some exposure to French bands competing. And if you look back, you can see that there's actually several instances of the military bands in France competing against each other, dating back to the 1830s. And there are records of these in the press, of these competitions taking place in Paris, in Dunkirk, in Calais, and all the way up really to the sort of 1840s. They weren't named competitions or contests as such. They were known as concours de musique. So, and the bands came together and played, and sums of prizes were offered up as for the winners. And it's very similar to competitions that we later had in the UK. The difference being that they were established by the various guards, the Garde Républicaine and so forth in France, as a way of battling it out between them rather than using their rifles and bayonets, presumably.
a much more peaceful way to settle our disputes, I would say, and musically. Gavin, thank you so much for that insight into our very earliest competitions. I mean, the fact that we're, early 1800s, we're issuing challenges between bands, and the clergy are adjudicating. It's so close, but also so far from our modern contest. And thank you so much for all your insights. I'm going to put links to Gavin's website, IBEW, as well, and all of the information that Gavin's accumulated over the years if you want to have a further look. But thank you, Gavin, so much for your time. That's brilliant.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Helen.
If you like the podcast, please help it to grow by liking, sharing, rating and reviewing. You can also support the podcast by leaving a tip or buying a perk, including asking my next guest a question or getting a shout out via fan list. Link in the show notes. Podcast music is Mephistopheles, performed by the Illinois Brass Band.